This is Dave Meltzer with Entrepreneurs, the Playbook, and I am excited because I have my very first rocket scientist on, Ozan Varol, and he even had to teach me how to say his name. That's how much of a rocket scientist I am. He's written a new book that I think is so pertinent right now. Think Like a Rocket Scientist. It's coming out April 14th. Couldn't be a better date. I always say, I wish I was launching a book right now because never before have board games and books been more popular. Thank
Well,
you.
it was great to be on. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's so funny because we were just discussing, I had some mishaps on my Instagram Live this morning. I was with my family, and my wife, of course, said the most known statement about rocket scientists, right? What are you, a rocket scientist? Or you don't have to be. You actually are. I'm curious, what type of education does it take? I'm always into skills, knowledge, and desire. What type of education does it take in order to be a true rocket scientist?
That's a great question. So there is actually no college major that's called rocket science, and people don't actually have a job title called rocket scientist either. It's used more informally to refer to the physics and engineering behind, or the science and engineering behind space travel. And so my own education was in astrophysics. I got my degree at Cornell, but you can be an engineer as well. So like aerospace engineering is another path into rocket science. But I went the science route. I became an astrophysics major and worked on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project, which sent 2 rovers to Mars in 2003.
Now, I got to ask this question. I've asked this of several astronauts that have been on. I always blame my wife for the question, but as an astrophysicist, a scientist, do you believe there's extraterrestrial life?
I do believe there is extraterrestrial life. It's probably going to take us a long time to find them, but I do believe they're out there somewhere. The universe is too big for us
I agree. I think
to
it'll
be the
take.
only living. Yeah.
I think they'll find us before we find them. That's my
Yep.
philosophy.
Yep. I mean, they might be way too far away from us to actually locate them, but I think they're out there.
You know, another thing is looking at the education behind being a rocket scientist. I want to focus in on because I'm so curious about your book and can't wait to read it when it comes out. You know, how to think like a rocket scientist. It sounds like a great way to think. How does a rocket scientist think about the compressed uncertain times that we're in? Because I think one of the things about being a rocket scientist is there's so much uncertainty. Sure. That certainty is still uncertain to most people. So how, do you think like a rocket scientist, or how does the book apply to what we're dealing with today in this compressed uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a great question, because rocket scientists, you're right, Dave, they deal with uncertainty on a daily basis, because there is no such thing as zero risk launch. You still have to compete with physics, and so there's always uncertainty involved in space missions. And so I mean, it's sort of like just a regular day to them, to rocket scientists, the uncertainty we're dealing with. So they do a number of things to deal with uncertainty. One is to create redundancies and margins of safety, right? And I think this applies into the entrepreneurial world as well. So not just having a plan A, but a plan B and a plan C as well. So, if one of the components on a rocket fails, then you need to have some backups in place to make sure that the whole mission doesn't fail. And so from an entrepreneurial perspective, that might mean, you don't just rely on one product, because if one product isn't selling because of the conditions we're operating in right now, then you can go to your product B or product C. Or if one of your marketing channels has become clogged because of what's happening, then you don't want to rely on a single marketing channel, and you want to hedge your bets a little bit. And then the other thing they do is margins of safety. And so you don't want to just create components, and this applies to the business world as well, that are just sort of on the edge of the breaking point. You want to leave some margin of error. If you're building a bridge, for example, you want to build it so that it's able to withstand weights that's going to be heavier than the vehicles that's going to be traveling on it, just in case something goes wrong. And I think the same idea applies to the business world as well. So using redundancies and margins of safety is really, really important. And then the other component is, we tend to see uncertainty as an enemy, as something to be feared, because uncertainty means things may not go as we planned. But that's also called life, right? Like, things don't go as planned in life. things are just the way they are. And so if you frame it that way, then the question becomes, which is the more productive question, what can you do about it? Like, we are operating in the world that we're operating in. How are you going to respond? Instead of spending time wishing that things had planned as you had hoped, you can just face reality and say, well, what can I do with the hand that I was dealt by the universe? And so you mentioned, for example, it's a good time perhaps to be launching a book, in the sense that people are stuck at home reading books, but my book tour was canceled. A lot of the in-person speaking engagements I had planned to promote the book were canceled. Bookstores are going to be closed on April 14th across the US when my book comes out. And there was definitely like a day or two when I was like, I ignored all the advice that I had in the book from my rocket science background. And I was freaking out and thinking, like, what am I going to do with this uncertainty? Like, all of my plans are just out the door. But then I went back to my rocket science training and said, look, this is the hand that I've been dealt. I can complain about it, or I can pivot to other ways, to doing virtual events, for example, to get the word out.
Yeah, and there is a huge learning curve in this virtual world. I had been egotistical about, having this top podcast and everything. I only do it live. And ever since I've been forced to do these in this capacity, not only have I been able to get more interesting guests because of scheduling is so easy, but some of the guests that my superpower in the space is relationship capital, because I ran such a big sports agency and marketing company, and I have tried to be a good person over the years that people like me. But even some of the greats, when we were available in person, everybody had demands of them, and they just didn't have time to sit down for 20 minutes in person, besides the crew that had to come and etc. Well, now from the top of the top people, they're available for me, and I'm sitting in my closet talking to them like I am with you. I've never had a rocket scientist on, and and I think it's mutually benefit, because I absolutely, I get pushed so many books, and the only title that I like better than yours is my new book's called "Don't Do Business with Dicks." But it's interesting when you talk about options, because I imagine in your space trial and error, learning lessons from the mistakes and mitigating the risk of those mistakes are a huge component of being a rocket scientist. They're expensive monetarily, your mistakes are, and two, they're life-threatening, which makes them very, very powerful mistakes. And so I love, the philosophy of, hey, we are practicing all these things. I'll tell you, as a venture capitalist in the angel realm, I could take $20 million, and it's amazing because I've put $2 million into 10 companies. 9 of them fail. Mm-hmm. But because of timing and tolerance, the one that doesn't makes $100 million. I net $80 million, and everybody in the world is like, David Meltzer is the smartest business person, right? He is a rocket scientist when it comes to capital. Meanwhile, that's worse than baseball odds. I'm batting 100, right? And forgive me, but if I go 2 for 10, I'm a super genius. I'm Einstein-like, in the physics world. I think people have to realize that all of these great scientists that understand statisticals and probabilities, that it's really still, like you said, you want to make God laugh, come up with a well-developed plan, but learn from it. Right. And when you learn from it and you mitigate risks, you actually can be seen as a genius, like a rocket scientist.
Absolutely. And I want to highlight 2 things in your answer, in your question, Dave, that I really like. So one is the idea that, so people are often afraid to aim high, afraid to take a moonshot, because they don't think it's going to work.
Mars shot. It's a Mars shot.
Yeah, a Mars shot, exactly. A Mars shot, even better. Exactly. I like that. Yep. And so, but the thing is, and this is a great example, right? You don't need all of your moonshots to take flight. If one of the 10 business deals you mentioned work well, that's going to pay for the ones that didn't work. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind, because I think we've been conditioned for decades to aim low, to fly low, to sort of set our sights low, as opposed to aiming high. But as long as your portfolio of ideas is balanced and you're not betting your future, your company's future, on a single moonshot, then what you're saying applies, which is you only need 1 or 2 of these to take flight, and those are going to pay for the ones that don't. So that's number one. And then the second part is the idea of learning from failure, which isn't discussed as often as I would like. There's this famous mantra in Silicon Valley, right? Fail fast, fail often, fail forward. Celebrating failure has become a huge thing in Silicon Valley. Companies are now holding funerals for failed startups, complete with like bagpipes and DJ spinning records, alcohol flowing freely. And I don't buy it. I don't buy it for two reasons. One is, no matter what Silicon Valley tells you, failure sucks. Like, I failed more times than I like to admit. Every time it sucked because there's a value judgment attached to failure, right? Failure is bad and success is good. But more importantly than that, when we fail, we're often none the wiser. And I cite some research in the book to back this up from both the medical world and the entrepreneurial world. But there was one study of, I think it was 65 cardiac surgeons who were performing this particular procedure. And the ones that failed to perform the procedure correctly tended to perform worse, not better, worse on future procedures. So not only did they not learn from their mistakes, but they ended up reinforcing bad habits. And so the goal really should be to learn fast, not to fail fast. Because if you're just going from one failure to the next without doing anything differently, without doing some self-awareness work of like some bad decisions you made may have led to that failure, if you're not spotting those and if you're not teasing them out and fixing them, then you're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So learn fast, not fail fast.
I love that. And one of the most powerful things I've learned in my own business is I give what's called a dummy tax award. So I get everybody together and I ask them what's the biggest mistake that they've made and what did they learn from it. And then whoever has kind of the biggest lesson that applies to the most people, I give them a bonus. So I'm encouraging people, you can't accelerate and expand unless you're making mistakes. You're going to make mistakes, but how are we learning from it? And what are we applying when we learn to it? The other thing I find interesting is that I believe the universe is a technology. And the people who have studied sciences and physics, and I'm a late bloomer when it comes to physics. My brother was a biochem major at Harvard, summa cum laude. He studied quantum physics, physics, and metaphysics early on and tried to encourage me to do so. I wasn't ready, but I have elevated my awareness to study it now. And I realize how the universe itself is a technology. And you're interplaying as a rocket scientist within the technology, not only of the rocket, but more importantly of the entire universe. And there's different laws of physics that apply in different atmospheres with different temperatures, different gravitational pulls and other things that you deal with. But even on a quantum level, I imagine that you've elevated your awareness to some of life's lessons that maybe you could share during this time. In a quantum level, I believe the quantum nature of humans is something I'm exploring in this quantum memory that I have that I believe has come from not only 4 generations, but past lives. I believe I'm built with a memory with a potential in certain areas, and I can expand those by practicing. Where does this fall in your philosophy or in the book or in your education?
Sure. I mean, I think the subconscious and the unconscious are very, very important. And there is a section in the book where I talk about the importance of the subconscious in creativity. This is chapter 4 on thought experiments. So in the modern world, we leave no room for boredom. Right? We're jumping from one notification to the next, one email to the next, one meeting to the next, without any space to just sit and be. Because a lot of us, and this was true for me up until a few years ago, I just thought that boredom was something that bored people did. Which just was so profoundly uninteresting. And I define boredom
on that. Boredom is something bored people do.
Exactly. And I'm like, I'm interesting, so I'm not gonna be bored. And I define boredom as spending large chunks of this unstructured time free of distractions. And that, it turns out, according to research, is central to creativity, because innovation is really hard when you're trying to clear out your inbox. It's during these moments of slack, not hard labor, that these insights arrive. And there's so many stories that I share in that chapter in the book where scientists, this is true, for example, for Werner Heisenberg, who's the creator of the uncertainty principle from quantum mechanics. He stumbles on the principle. He literally walks into the principle. he's taking a walk at a park. I think this was in Copenhagen, and it just comes to him like a lightning bolt. And there's so many examples of creative individual scientists who come upon these insights not during moments of hard labor, but when they're walking, when they're sitting in the sauna. For Einstein, it was playing the violin.
Yeah. And also he didn't get a job right out of school. He was the only one
Yeah,
in his class, right? And he had that time just to ponder. Some people think
exactly.
that set him on a different trajectory.
Oh, totally. You know, he was a just a lowly patent clerk in the Swiss patent office when he came up with the special theory of relativity. And his first paper looks nothing like a typical academic paper. There's like virtually no citations to other papers, which you're supposed to do. He just sort of launches into his own world. And it goes back to when he was 16 years old, where he posed himself this thought experiment. He asked, what would it be like to ride next to a beam of light? And it took him 10 years. And that gave us the special theory of relativity, in part because he let himself get bored and daydream. Because we think that the brain stops working when we're daydreaming, but it's not true. What's called the default mode network in the brain lights up when you're daydreaming, when you're letting your mind wander. And according to some studies, that's central to creativity. So as the saying goes, it's the silence between the notes that makes the music, and that applies to generating creative.
When I'm speaking and writing books and doing other things, I actually channel, right? And I do meditate every day, and
Mm-hmm.
I hope that people will practice meditation and whatever that means to them. It took me 13 years to continually develop this practice, but I step off a stage or in an interview sometimes, and people are like, "Oh my God, that's genius," and I have no idea what I say. And I'm interested in the perspective of a rocket scientist.
Yeah.
What is that channeling or process? Yeah, and I think you almost touched on it earlier. I'm just so curious of your perspective of why people are feel this way, or what is that process called, or how do we define that or utilize that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a precise definition for this, and it does vary from person to person. But if you look at any major scientific discovery, it begins with, going back to the earlier part of our discussion, profound uncertainty. So there's chaos, and then you get stuck with a problem, but you don't let it go. You sort of live with the problem for months, sometimes for years. You work on it, and then you take breaks. You come back to working on it, and then you take breaks, and then eventually the insight arrives. Now, so uncertainty makes people really uncomfortable. Being stuck with a problem makes people really uncomfortable because people want answers right away. But the insights usually arrive when you're willing to be patient and when you're willing to sit, and that might be through meditation, or it might be through taking a mindful walk through the park. And that's when those insights begin to arrive. There's a quote that I love from, I think, Arthur Schopenhauer. He says, genius hits the target that no one else talent hits the target that no one else can hit, but genius hits the target that no one else can see. And it's often that insight that's hiding under everybody else's nose that the creative, the scientists point to and say, look, there it is. But everybody else misses it because we're so busy moving from one thing to the next and not letting ourselves sit and let the subconscious do the work.
And then finally, where entrepreneurship reach science is so crucial. If you look at the greatest entrepreneurs, there's incredible technology and science behind what they're doing. And even today, one of the things that I read about with what's going on is, you look at the biggest fear or challenge that we face is not having enough respirators, right?
Right.
The real challenge is facilitating the people that are critically, in jeopardy of their lives. So someone came up with, an entrepreneur takes the science and says, hey, let's figure out how to hook up 9 people to a respirator.
Right.
All of a
Yeah.
sudden, you just divided the problem by 9.
Yeah.
And so, there's such a great marriage between technology and entrepreneurship, even within rocket science. For you, how do you balance between the two? Because obviously you are entrepreneurial, you've written this
Right.
great book, How to Think Like a Rocket Scientist, but you also have the science behind it. Do you see them hand in hand, or how do you marry the two?
No, I do see them hand in hand. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was because one, rocket science tends to be very intimidating to a lot of people, hence the saying, right, it's not rocket science. And so people see that and run away. But the thing is, after I spent time, 4 years working on this Mars mission and left rocket science to first go into law, became a lawyer, then a law professor, now I'm writing and speaking and podcasting. I never stopped applying those insights. And those insights, the 9 simple strategies that I share in the book, are applicable regardless of what field you're working in, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an academic or a writer. And so going back to just one of the strategies I share in the book, for example, is the importance to rocket scientists of reframing problems, reframing questions to generate better answers. So the respirator example you mentioned, Dave, the assumption, the status quo is that one respirator is one for one person. But if you step back and ask, well, what if it was for 9 people, right? So reframing the problem to say, well, that is an assumption, but we can question that assumption and see the problem in a different light to generate a better answer that people may have missed. So an example of this from my rocket science past is, so this was 1999. And so at the time, our mission, it was later called the Mars Exploration Rovers mission, but at the time we were planning to send 1 rover to Mars in 2003. This is 1999, we're busy designing our own rover, and that year, another lander called the Mars Polar Lander crashed onto the Martian surface. Now, this wasn't our baby, but we were planning to use the exact same landing mechanism that the Mars Polar Lander had used. Understandably, our mission got scrapped because, our landing mechanism just failed spectacularly on the Martian surface. And so we went back to the drawing board and we're trying to come up with a new way of landing on Mars that's actually going to get us safely onto the Martian surface. And I remember one day distinctly, my boss, who was the principal investigator of the mission, he came into my office and said, I just got off the phone with the administrator of NASA, and he asked me a simple question. He said, what if we sent 2 rovers instead of 1? At the time, NASA's practice was to send 1 rover to Mars every 2 years and, keep your fingers crossed that nothing bad happens along the way. Now, that simple question that nobody had thought about asking before reframed the problem, because the problem wasn't just this faulty landing system. We were going to fix that. But even if you fix that, there are so many things that can go wrong when you're sending this delicate robot 40 million miles through outer space. So instead of putting all our eggs in one spacecraft's basket, we decided to send 2 rovers instead of 1. And these were called Spirit and Opportunity. They were built to last for 90 days. Spirit lasted for 6 years until it got stuck on soft soil. And Opportunity, and I still get goosebumps when I say this, Opportunity lasted for 14 years into its 90-day mission, simply because someone was willing to step back and see the problem in a different light and ask a question that no one had thought about asking before. We tend to think that breakthroughs begin with smart answers, but they actually begin with smart questions.
I love that. And I can't wait to read How to Think Like a Rocket Scientist. Since we're both lawyers and both studied law, I think I'm going to follow your book with How to Think Like a Lawyer. It'll be a picture book with somebody sucking out half your brain with a straw. And I mean that in the best light. I'm a recovering lawyer as you are, but anyway, what a treat this has been. I love the way you look at things. It reminds me of what Dr. Wayne Dyer says: if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, which I think is one of the most powerful physics statements ever created. It is truly a physics statement when you think about it. It's been an absolute pleasure. You got to reach out, go buy that book, How to Think Like a Rocket Scientist. I think everyone out there has the capability to do so, and we all would benefit greatly in an abundant philosophy. Thank you so much. I got Ozan Varol here with me, Dave Meltzer, on Entrepreneurs, the Playbook.